Before I left Madrid, I was working on a text for a book of essays that may or may not come into being at some point in the future. And I'm writing this text on, well, right now it's called Instrument and Language. So instruments and musical language, but the title is going to change, and clearly the text is going to expand because this last weekend I was at Sonoscopia in Oporto, and there were several people, including yourself, talking about their understanding of what an instrument is, or at least they were conveying their understanding of what an instrument is through the way they were talking about their own instruments, or how they had developed them or invented them, or what they were expecting of them and what they were doing or not doing with them. And so that was a real breath of fresh air for me, because it opened up an awful lot of ground, almost too much ground, because the minute you start thinking about some of the definitions that they were giving to instruments and some of the things they were expecting of them and of themselves with respect to the instrument and to the music that they wanted to make or hear or create, then by extension you get this redefinition of, or even abandonment of, traditional categories. And so, I mean, starting, like the classic paradigm where you have the composer and the performer in the audience, and the instrument is in the hands of the performer, who by 19th century practice is expected to dominate the instrument. They're supposed to have so much control of the instrument that they can do whatever they want with it. Or you have this kind of cyborg idea that the instrument is just an extension of the musician's body, or even an extension of the musician's will or imagination, but that there's this incredible transparency between what the musician wants to do. Some of them were talking about what the musician wants to express. I think that's another conversation. Yeah. And yet, that's really this old paradigm of who makes the music, who creates the music, and then who actually substantiates the music as sound, and how they do so, and what tools they use, and how the tools are supposed to do what they do, and how the technique for those instruments is absolutely determined already by the musical language, and blah, 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 blah. And then you have like the free improviser's approach, where each individual improviser is kind of inventing their own language within the historicity or limitations that their own period imposes on them conceptually, you know. But they're making their own language, and they are often establishing some kind of dialogue with the instrument, where it's not about a totally hierarchical domination. It's more about checking out the different possibilities that the instrument has that are not canonical from the classical point of view, and somehow having the language expand in those terms. But that's still thinking about an instrument as an inanimate object with no possibility to furnish anything other than its own quirks, should we say. And then what was happening this weekend is suddenly here are people talking about something that's a lot closer to some of the things that I'm doing also, and certainly that you're doing, which has to do with blurring the lines between who's creating each sound and where the listening starts and stops, and what the criteria, not what the criteria are, but what they affect, and suddenly you've got these instruments, if that's what they are, depending on, and that's kind of the point, how you define them, are these instruments specifically going to be played by someone, or do they play themselves? So when you're actually designing this instrument, are you designing something to be played, or are you designing something that actually plays itself or plays the music? And then how so and to what degree? Because then are you going to say, well, a cassette player is an instrument too, or a player piano, or a CD player, is that an instrument? Understood in its traditional sense, that you put a disc in and you push a button and it makes sound. Is it now a musical instrument because of that? Or, and if so or if not, then how do you understand this instrument that is made to work within certain boundaries, or to listen to what you're doing and respond, or what someone else is doing, or external sounds or whatever, and respond in some way? So then you're sharing sort of the questions of listening and of criteria for response. And I mean, it opens up an area where the traditional structure of composer, performer, instrument, audience is out the window. And it's really a totally different, there's maybe the same set of stages, but they're not as separate as they were. And what or whom or what or who is doing them is not necessarily the same. It's fascinating, really. So, you know.
Yeah, I mean, there's a thing which at least for my, like the stuff that I was doing, came into focus in a way that was useful to me, but I'll kind of try to put it in a way that makes sense here. But this, what you're referring to, is like a traditional model of like composer and all these things. And generally speaking, there's notation is one of these steps as well, and interpretation on the side of the performer. So it's usually a long sausage that is the traditional model. But the pushing, like, that fails us now in very obvious ways that we probably need to talk about too much, but it's no longer useful as a model for what we do, you and I, or a lot of people making music now. It fails that. But the artifice of that model, which I've kind of called to myself sometimes like a conceptual quantization, where by making set these parts of a creative process that can be quite fluid, discrete, still puts an emphasis on this archaic view of it. So for myself, as much as possible, I try not to think of, oh, well, now I'm thinking like a composer, so I'll make these blah, blah, blah decisions. And now I'm thinking like an instrument maker, so I'll make these decisions. And now I'm performing, so I'll make these decisions. That may very well end up happening along the way, but by having them defined as categories or types of behavior or types of creative thinking, it can limit things that fall in between this, which is a lot of the core of what you're talking about, is this stuff that isn't those things. And if those things fail to, it's not even failing to capture, they specifically don't capture because it is not A or B. So therefore, it is a bit like it doesn't work as a category anymore. So sometimes I find that, like, just trying to think of it in a different way, which in your sense, there's a big primacy on dialogue and communication and interaction and not interpretation, but dynamics and things like this. That is central. So I can see how this idea of framing things in terms of language, as specifically relative to instrument, it could be a very useful model for thinking about it, because you put at the forefront what it is that's valuable to you.
Yeah.
And not in a monetary sense, as in like aesthetically meaningful to you. This is what matters. And then you're thinking, and like some sort of framework around that supports that idea, instead of being like, I find dialogue important, so that means the composer must engage with an audience through community interaction, which will then influence the music. You know, you have to make this really convoluted thing to get at what you're trying to get at here. And again, it's because the model.
Well, the minute you think about dialogue, you are automatically making separate entities. How separate they are from each other, it remains to be seen, and whether the dialogue itself is the linking factor is open to question. But certainly, if you see it as one process only, then there is not dialogue, because there are no constituent parts. There's only the thing that happens, or I don't.
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
But obviously, the minute you start to redistribute those elements, then the minute you start to redistribute the constituent parts of dialogue, then you have to redefine the elements that are dialoguing. I guess that's what I mean. And so in that process, you're rethinking what you mean by composer, if in fact that word is even valid at this point. You're rethinking what you mean by instrument, you know. And I mean, this didn't happen last night.
Yeah.
The people who are programming are involved with this constantly, because the line between programming as composition and programming as instrument design, that line, I don't think it really even exists, in fact. But that to me, that's one of the most interesting things, because the minute that line disappears, the idea of what an instrument is also has to be either the word instrument should be abandoned, or it should go back to its non-specialized meaning, so that like a fork is an instrument and a robot musician is an instrument, but in the same sense, practically. I don't know. I don't know. Is there some... Okay, you're making clear that there are ways of thinking about this that are too rooted in the past, or possibly excessively rooted in the need to view all of this as dialogue. Because I mean, I'm the first one to recognize that a lot of times if you deal with improvisation, and especially free improvisation, if you're coming from it from a compositional paradigm, you miss a lot of things, or you overvalue or underestimate or undervalue a lot of things. So maybe the fact that I'm sort of coming at the question of instrument and musical language from the perspective of an improviser is going to cause the same kind of distortion for me. In other words, I value dialogue so much because I'm involved in a kind of music that's made with dialogue.
Yeah.
And therefore, if I look at an instrument, that paradigm is there for me. And maybe it's not for some of the people we saw this weekend.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's very much the case, but I wouldn't necessarily view it as a distortion, as more as like you're actually framing it.
Mm-hmm.
Like the categories are, if there are to be categories, are these to you. So there isn't, this doesn't stand in contrast to something else. It doesn't stand in, like it is the reality of what improvisation is for you,
right,
is centered on dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
So the concept of instrument, in as much as it may be useful to that, would be as a subset of what one can use to create or engage in dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
So like we're having a dialogue now. Am I an instrument in the fact that we're making a video and we have a topic that like it becomes a little absurd to think of it in that manner, but it's not too different from what we're talking about in terms of like, is this pile of sticks and strings that I've made an instrument, or is the bit of code we've written an instrument? Because what we're doing is something else. And this is what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
There isn't another thing. We're doing this thing now.
Mm-hmm.
So the categories that exist, are you the composer here? You know, like it becomes absurd, very quickly. And so I think in what's important to the thing that you're doing, which in this sense is improvisation, specifically like a very interactive dialogical one, dialogue, yeah, sure.
Why not?
That's the thing, and then any categories are just subsets of that thing that don't necessarily need an additional contextualization.
I guess that would be an understanding of where I am with my own music, but I'm still thinking about how these people we saw this weekend were approaching this. Partly because, not because of how much what they're doing is contrasting with what I'm doing, but more because of what they're doing is contrasting so much among them.
Yeah.
So we had this couple from Germany, I guess, Marion, and I've forgotten the man's name. I don't remember. But they were making these instruments. I mean, they were calling them instruments. And they were even calling them robot instruments, and they made reference to the Logos Foundation having the largest robot orchestra in Europe or in the world or whatever. And that they did not make, at least to me, they did not make it entirely clear where language was in terms of instrument. In other words, whether they set out to make a particular kind of instrument because they had particular kind of sound world in their head, or whether they set out to make an instrument and then wanted to see what kind of sound world it had, and then they were going to have it make music from there, or whether those two things were feeding each other. I mean, I'm back in my dialogue thing. Okay, but to compare all of that, in which they really showed us no musical examples, or shall I say sonic examples of what they were doing, to the guy from Angola who was building these instruments that you play with your thumbs or that you pluck or whatever, and then putting them in a context of not, I mean, to say unadventurous would be generous, I think, classical European music tradition and tuning and instrumentation and behavior. And he was inserting these things into that. So that to me, that was a totally different idea of like, what do you do? Well, he said, I'm a musician. I happen to invent instruments, and people look at me as an instrument inventor, but I think of myself as a musician. Okay, but then why are you inventing these instruments? Because the language you're using is, it's like 19th century. I mean, it's, you know.
I mean, that becomes a whole separate like tangential discussion, like something like the Bachet brothers, who make really beautiful sounding and really interesting instruments, and then horrifyingly, disappointingly, make music like this with them.
Well, Lazary, the composer who did all that stuff with the Bachets, is horrible.
Right.
I don't know if I've ever heard anything musically invented by the Bachet brothers.
Yeah,
They
which is a shame because they're fascinating instruments.
Yeah, they are.
And that ends up in a whole separate discussion in terms of like what the function of making new instruments in a larger sense is. But in some of this discussion of one of the questions that was posed on the first day, like after I presented and the Gamma Inc. presented, was whether how you as an individual functions in the do you have an idea first and then make an instrument, or do you make an instrument and then get the ideas, or whatever, like this chicken and egg kind of discussion? And I think my answer was something along the lines of it's both, which is a very obvious answer that is there. But in thinking about it, it's almost like a weird framing of the question in like, I don't know, this is a terrible metaphor here, but like, you know, we're going to have omelets for dinner or whatever. And it's like, well, do you want me to crack it into the bowl first or the pan first? It's like, I don't care. We're having omelets for dinner.
Yeah.
Like some of the specifics of that don't really matter. So the linear, like the time-based relationship as to what happened first and how those things interact doesn't factor for me very greatly.
In your own work,
In my own thinking.
in your own.
It may very well happen, and I may very well make an instrument and then get ideas based on that, or vice versa. But I'm not sitting around thinking like there's a sound I am imagining. I want to realize an instrument to make it, or have arbitrarily started building some odd thing
Yeah.
that I will now take inspiration from. So like the paradigm of it
Right.
is not one that resonates with me.
Right.
Even though I can
Yeah.
answer the question.
Well, to me, okay, that brings up another point, I think, that's actually very interesting, because there's a third element here. In your case, and in my case, which is the body. And that's the element, for me, that's missing in gammon, is that what they're called? Gamut, yeah, gamut ink, yeah. Because they're designing these robot instruments in which the human body is basically uninvolved. And yet you play and I play. And we both come from other instruments. I think they do too, but it doesn't seem to have affected them in the same way. So there's a place where it may not be either the sound or the instrument in the first place. It's the body. And it's like, well, I feel this, so where are we going with this? And in fact, I think that's also something that was brought up at some point to talk about Buchla,
Right.
about whether you approach the synthesizer from the inside and then figure out what kind of controls you're going to put on it, or whether you start with how your body can handle controls, and then you go from there into how you, so that thing that's coming out of the body itself, where is that for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think unavoidable in that, not unavoidable as in like, it is a big part of it in that like I tend to still, generally speaking, have instruments in a traditional sense involved. There's usually some sort of acoustic sound source in the form of either a drum or something that like existed before I existed, that has nothing to do with me. So there's often something like that. Or if there is something I've made or adapted or just misusing, like a thing like a comb, I'm engaging with it in a physical manner.
Yeah.
And that this isn't because I place some special emphasis on physical reality, acoustic sounds, analog, like this kind of like that is unimportant to me.
Yeah.
I happen to have played a lot of instruments, so I have a lot of physical and mental dexterity for manipulating things, which it can sometimes be acoustic and sometimes not. So it does factor greatly in that. And even when we were playing yesterday, we were talking about like we're going to kind of some places where, because of some of the objects I have and the nature, in the way that I'm using them, there's things that I can kind of get out of that I would have struggled with in another way, because and for various reasons I've done things to be able to make that possible. So the body is definitely there. Like even though I do some robotic stuff, and in my performance the other day I did have solenoids used in a manner very similar to what they described. They're not directly controlled by me, although that's not accurate, but like they're separate from me. They activate on their own, but it was incorporated in a context that is different from what they were discussing. So I think the body like is there, but I think much like the chicken or the egg of the instrument or the imagination, I also isn't something I center either. And I would probably have to dig and we could tangent further into like what it is I actually do center, because it isn't necessarily this either, but I do think it is of significance. And it's of significance, and one of the people I enjoy playing with a lot is like P. Tremblay, which was my supervisor before, which we've talked about some. I enjoy playing with him quite a bit. He uses a laptop quite virtuosically, and also generally an instrument, and both together, which is hard to do.
But using the laptop to manipulate the sound of the instrument?
Both.
Or also to generate sound itself?
Both.
And when he uses it to generate sound itself, is he playing it, or is it generating sounds with some kind of software that causes it to generate sound?
not necessarily automatically. So he uses it in a way that like, which for me seems like the worst. But like he uses a mouse and the keyboard and
Yeah,
he's in
old
there,
school.
yeah, like doing like he doesn't have things mapped to keys like how you do.
Uh-huh.
And he has some controllers, but not actually these days he's using like an iPad for that. But we have many discussions about this with him and I in terms of like high level control versus low level control, and we're on opposite ends of the spectrum. So he wants to control that one parameter, so he'll move his mouse and grab it and control, do this.
Yeah.
And he's just quite good at that. And there's limits to certain things that he can do as a result, but like
Which is true of every instrument in the
yes,
world.
absolutely.
Always.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we're sort of on opposite ends of that spectrum in terms of what we choose to deal with while we perform and expose when we program.
Uh-huh.
But he is good at that. And he's using instrument as well, and we can play together. So like we did a lot of playing together where I had my drum set and laptop, and he had his bass and laptop, and we can go all sorts of places involving any combination of all of those things.
Right.
And it's not, I guess I bring that as, it's not insignificant that he's a bass player, and is also in performance context playing a bass. So this thing that you're highlighting of the body and what that means in a performative way is present, is significant.
Okay, yesterday when we were improvising, you were commenting that the thing you have set up on the snare drum with the little lever, which comes from seeing DJs and developing a gestural language that is also sonically similar to what the DJs are doing with the same kind of gestures. That the way you have instantiated that is limited if you want to go in certain directions rather than sort of in what is the basic direction that you had conceived for that instrument, which brings up innumerable questions within this context, one of which would be is how important is it to you to be able to move in a wide variety of directions with an instrument? One of them would be if, in fact, you had foreseen some kind of direction when you began to invent this instrument, how would you define that direction? Would you define it in terms of musical stuff or in terms of just physical stuff, or am I still drawing distinctions where they really don't exist? Or I mean, because for me, the question of dialogue is obviously on different levels. One of them is mapping or understanding my interaction with my own instrument in terms of dialogue, and which it has to do partly also with how much I'm writing into the software of the instrument that's allowing it to surprise me. But then the other consideration there is that I'm sitting here playing with you. Last week I was playing with a cellist. And next week I'm going to be playing with a violinist and a dancer. And so for me, the designing the instrument involves being sure that I have enough freedom that I can go in quite different directions at the same time. Now, what I have on the screen in my instruments are 28 modules. They're not all different from each other. There may be a group of 4 that are the same, but depending on what we understand by instrument, you could say, well, your laptop is not the instrument. The software is a group of instruments, which is a model that any percussionist knows, because anybody who's done any serious performing of sort of contemporary percussion music knows that you put together a group of instruments for a piece, and then that group is either a group of instruments or an instrument, a composite instrument, however you want to call it. But perhaps what I've got is similar to that, and what you're doing with the DJ thing would be one element in a larger, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, for me, that thing is something I think about in terms of my improvisational language, separate from even the sounds or the instrument, is the I tend to think of it like not painting the walls of a room. So let's say we're in a musical space, and that musical space doesn't need to be defined by extremity. So like in any given performance, I don't need to be the loudest I can be and the quietest I can be and the highest and the lowest, and et cetera, et cetera. Like extremity is useful, but it isn't. I don't value it as like fundamentally obvious. Like, oh, there, I look at all this range. That's great. Because I think there can be a tendency with. I mean, you referred to it the other day as almost like a kid in a candy store type thing, where it's like I'm improvising and it's like I can do this and I can do this and I can do this and I can do this, and look how different this is from what I was doing before, which I think is, for me, like can be aesthetically cheap very quickly. So there's like a musical language version of that that exists outside of an instrument specific context, where showing all the things you can do is a gesture that one can make, which I don't value very much.
Yeah.
That then has repercussions specifically to instrument, and in this case, like range of sounds, if we're speaking that way. So even when we played together, so like when we played together yesterday, I used this instrument, like a smaller tool piece instrument, whatever, that I've been working on that doesn't do a lot of things because it wasn't designed with that in mind. But we still improvise in an interesting manner, and I went to places that I hadn't before, and I think that says a lot about us as improvisers and so on. But I think it wasn't meant to, like, I wouldn't go on, like, if I'm going to play with people for the rest of my life, it's not going to be with that one thing.
Right.
You know, because that's not what it's for.
Yeah.
When we've played together, most often in the past, I've used a larger sort of software tool I have that is made up of, similar to yours, loads of different things that I've built over the years that are just kind of all there, and I can access all of them at any given point. And even when I do that, I tend to avoid, as much as I'm consciously possible, to not do a survey of things, because I don't want to hear a survey of things.
To me, actually, this is a conversation that I had with John Butcher in London several months ago, almost a year ago now, I guess. I had seen a saxophonist play a solo in Madrid, and her strategy was basically to create a series of small pieces, each of which was based on some sort of extended technique. Okay, now I'm going to take the mouthpiece off and I'm going to do a piece with the mouthpiece. And now I'm going to pick up the alto sax and I'm going to do different things involving blowing across the whole of the neck. And now I'm going to stick a bottle of water down in the bell, and I'm going to close all the keys, and I'm going to open things and make some kind of a piece with that. Which I found to be more of a show than a discourse per se. And I was discussing this with John in particular because he has one of the most complete and vast arrays of extended techniques on his instrument, which is also a saxophone. Yet they are used continually to articulate ideas that are actually almost old-fashioned a lot of the time. Like he may be making just a straightforward melodic line, but one of the notes is practically pure breath, and another one has some kind of multiphonic, which is tremoloing, and then the next one involves biting the reed or whatever. But behind that, there is a musical idea in a much older sense of what a musical idea is. I mean, really older than Xenakis or Penderecki or any of that, right? So and in the case of my instrument, that is expanded by the fact that while I certainly have a vast variety of possibilities, when I say vast, I'm not being presumptuous. It's quite the opposite. It's like when you go into a library and there's a vast number of books there, 98% of which you've never read. So it's
generous percentage that.
yeah, 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 yeah. Well, so what I mean is, in my case, these possibilities could be grouped in terms of how you approach them with your body. It's like this way I'm working in this kind of world, and this way I'm working in this other kind of world. So some stuff is happening with a piezo mic, and I'm playing with it with a comb or a bow or a stick, and some of it involves pushing certain buttons and moving my hand around on the mouse, which allows me to phrase in a particular way, and other things are field recordings that I'm manipulating the speed and the frequency, the pitch shift and the filter and others, et cetera, et cetera. But for me, the challenge has been not only to not try to use those as strategies, but also to reach the point that, for example, John reached a long time ago, which is that I'm just building discourse, and I'm often involved in at least 3 of those parts of the instrument at the same time in order to make sounds, to make phrases or sonic discourse of some kind that is not dependent on any one of them. That's not a compositional or a discursive argument. It's simply one of a series of techniques that I hope to be able to combine freely across the piece. And from a standpoint of dialogue, again, that has partly to do with the fact that I may be dialoguing with someone whose instrument goes to similar places, but in very different kinds of combinations, because the instrument they play allows them to be working with 2 kinds of materials that both come from a very similar technique in their instrument and from vastly different ones in mine. It seems like there's almost the opposite. It seems like the opposite end of that spectrum is the same for you, in the sense that while you may not think of a series of techniques as being determinant in your discourse, possibly more so in your language, but not so much in your discourse, and yet you're inventing an instrument which is deliberately constrained, then isn't that a way of determining?
Yeah.
So, I mean, how different is that than saying, okay, now I'm going to take the mouthpiece and I'm going to just make a piece by blowing into the mouthpiece?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like I can unpack like some intentionality and stuff in it. I think it's probably simpler in that, like, I think some people make music I like and some people make music I like.
Uh-huh.
So like that, I could probably just categorize it like that.
I think that's, yeah, I certainly know that the minute you condemn something, someone will come along who does exactly that brilliantly.
Yeah, totally. So like
Yeah.
I was gonna have a firmer worded version of that, where I was gonna say like some people make shitty music and some people make good music, but I don't think it's that. It's some music that I like or don't like.
Yeah.
But I think in a situation like that, I don't know, with that one, it just feels like, and it's something that perhaps is because I've played a lot of percussion stuff or object things or mixed setups or in context where there's multiple things, it is very easy to do multiple things. Mm-hmm. You know, like if you have all your ducks in a row, you have a row of ducks.
Yes.
Like this is by the definition. So I have a lot of things. So it's very easy, and I'm sure I did it when I was learning and doing all this, where I did this and I did this and I did this and I did this, and then in listening back or seeing other people play, realizing that doesn't, like, I have a vocabulary of X amount of words. If I'm going to sit here and talk with you,
right.
If I just start rattling through them, you know, we're not gonna get very far.
Well, that's one of the reasons why I just made that distinction between musical language and musical discourse. because
Yeah.
they are not the same.
No, no.
Yeah, yeah. To shift the whole thing a little bit, because when I started talking, I was talking about how some of your work and some of my work and some of the work we saw at Sonoscopia this weekend was involved instruments that make certain decisions
Yeah.
that we would normally be making or traditionally would be made by the performer, him or herself, or the composer, him or herself, or themselves nowadays. So that's a question. That was the question that I was opening with, but we're on one end of this. I mean, I hate to set it up so as such a binary thing, but for the people who are listening to music, maybe they're performers also, or players, or composers, or instrument builders, or who knows. But at that moment, they're sitting in a chair, looking and listening to something that someone like you or I are doing on stage or in front of them, at any rate. Okay, so at that moment, when you pass some of that kind of decision making to the instrument or the whatever it is, what kind of model do you have for how the audience reads things? In other words, okay, you come from percussion. Percussion, double bass, cello, are instruments that it is particularly easy to read gesture. And so your visual experience of a specific musical presentation, shall we say, or utterance, is often possible for people whose ability to read human intention or intentionality is greater than their ability to understand a particular kind of musical language or discourse or style or practice or whatever. So if you take some of that gesture out and you actually put it into the machine or instrument or whatever, how does that change the audience's experience of what's going on? I mean, is there a different model for explaining how that works, or?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certain. Yeah, there's all sorts of, I think, people who are into this kind of idea, or particularly people who play, even in a more extreme version of you, where it's just software. It's not even the person at the machine. So there's all sorts of discourse around that kind of stuff. I think for me, like my own personal purchase, like it's kind of simpler. Like I don't care is maybe like probably like the shorter answer, and that
What do you not care about?
of how it may be read. But I think some of that is like I'm in a position, as you said, like I'm doing things, and because of the nature of the instrument or instruments I play, they happen to visually communicate and look in a manner that creates intentionality or whatever. So things that an audience may find as a cue for aesthetic interest or meaning. I think, I mean, that's easily tricked as well as like very handy performers, you know, like that's a whole thing itself. But I think what an audience may perceive or not is, I tend to not worry about it so much because I don't know. I mean, maybe very simply, like I make a lot of videos and there's no audience, it doesn't exist. You know, so it's physically removed.
Yeah, but you're making a video.
Yeah, yeah. But
You're not
what I
making
mean,
a sound recording.
yeah, but what
So
I mean
the
to say is
visual,
that-
the
that-
visual reading is there.
Yeah, but I have no relationship with those people. If anybody ever does watch it,
Yeah,
like, it's
right.
temporally and spatially divorced.
Right.
So I think maybe it's not insignificant that that's the case, but I think if for me anyways, like if an over concern with what may be legible or not, or I'm trying to do things in a manner that communicates this. I don't know. It isn't terribly important to me, and I think, yeah,
Oh, I think you may be misunderstanding what's
it's possible.
underlying my question because for me it's not about concern. It's not like, oh, gee, my work isn't visual enough, they're not going to understand me. Or I bet I'd be a lot better if I'd get a lot more gigs if, if I I mean, I was going to say wiggle my head, but I wiggle my head all the time, nothing I can do about it, so that's not the case. For me, it's more about having a tool to think with. It's like what kind of model is interesting for thinking about that part of this whole continuum that goes from whatever you had for breakfast to how the person who's hearing the concert that night is hearing it and in what terms. It's one whole continuum, and the more parts of that I have ways of thinking about, the more interesting it is for me, but not because they are not necessarily matters of concern. They're more like tools.
Yeah, or I mean, they have an impact, like the breakfast thing, like whether you want it to or not. It's not necessarily a tool for you. Like if
Yeah.
it was especially cold that day, you'll play differently.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not
Mm-hmm.
it's not you harnessing the weather for your aesthetic.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, that yeah, like if you're in a room, if the people are vibing, and if it's quiet, if they're talking over it, all of things will obviously have an impact.
Right.
But I guess all of that was to say that like it isn't something I think about too much, or it isn't too central for me in terms of what like I guess I feel like I'm doing in that sense. But I think I think maybe the concept of dialogue, although super important for me, is perhaps more central for you, in which this communication as a dispersed thing that's happening is it. So like they are part of that fabric that happens.
Yeah. Yeah. To me, the difference between a video and a live performance is not just, well, I mean, I was drawing a similarity before, which was that there is a visual experience of what you're doing, even in a video. But for me, as someone who studied composition for a long time, I don't know if I learned a lot, but I certainly studied for a long time. The decision to improvise rather than to compose, I continue to compose, but I compose in specific moments because there's certain kind of ideas that's the best way to work with them, or because there's certain kinds of material that I will not be satisfied with how I've been able to work with that material in a collective and on the moment treatment. So I will compose then, but essentially for me there is a social element to making music that I want to be directly involved in. And the way for me to be directly involved in that is to be playing, and to be playing possibly with others, possibly alone, and possibly with an audience with which I want to establish some kind of a loop, an energy loop. Because for me, one of the essential, possibly the quintessential aspect of improvising, and the one that links me to almost every other aspect of music that's really important to me, is listening, not playing. And I think when you go out and you improvise with other musicians, when you improvise with other musicians in front of an audience, or when you improvise alone with an audience, what you have in common with all of those people is that you're all listening. I just certainly hope so. Anyway, so that the way you receive energy from an audience, the way you send energy to an audience, the way you receive and send energy vis-a-vis the other musicians you're working with, to me it's tangible, and it generates change in almost every way. And that's what music is about for me, really, you know, which is possibly why I was asking you about the audience thing, because that's so much a part of it. If there's anything underlying all the questions that I've been putting out, or all the value judgments that I've been spewing, it's listening. Because if you talk about, okay, you're designing an instrument that is making decisions rather than the performer making all the decisions, or rather than the composer making all the decisions, to me, all of those decisions are about listening, really. I was reading David Toop's, the first volume of his sort of history of free improvisation, Into the Maelstrom, I think it's called, something like that. And he quoted, I believe it's from a feminist text from the 1970s, but I don't clearly recall, someone distinguishing as drawing a difference that they considered important, which I do too, and which obviously Toop does, between dialectics and dialogue. And this is something I said the other day in Sonoscopia too, that a dialectic is about a thesis and antithesis and how they reach some kind of synthesis. And I think, at least in free improvisation, dialogue is much more interesting, because you don't have to reach any kind of synthesis. You can agree to disagree, so to speak, or you can not even agree to disagree. Yeah. and you can be a lot less polite. This is something I think the English are very good at, to be a lot less polite than you would be in a conversation, so that the music is sometimes more aggressive, and sometimes not aggressive, but much more unexpected, and therefore much more dynamic. And those dynamics of dialogue, I think, make improvisation very interesting. I think sometimes they make some very interesting improvisations that are not interesting as music. Sometimes they make very interesting music as well, but that I think there is something very that I've seen more in London than anywhere else, that's about, or with British musicians, that's about negotiating the dialogue. And they're negotiating it sonically, but it's working on that level. It's not so much we're making sounds together or we're making music together. It's we're using sound to negotiate some kind of a relationship. And I don't know, I find that very stimulating.
If you'd like to support the making of these videos, please join our Patreon. The link is in the description below. Thanks for watching.